Hey, welcome to my channel. My name's Ash and I'm a small PC builder out of Chicago. Currently a full-time student and I build PCs on the side. I started selling PCs in August of 2024 and wanted to do a recap on what has happened for the last 6 months. And I know I'm a little late on this, so bear with me. By doing this, hopefully I can give a realistic perspective of how it is flipping PCs in this economy as someone who doesn't have as much traction as other YouTubers. So, yeah, let's get to it. So in August I sold 2 PCs. I'm going to give you a little backstory on how I started off. I started off with $500 and I bought 2 PCs for $200 and used the rest of the money for SSDs and anything else I needed. I built them in mid-July and sold them in early August. The first PC had a Ryzen 5 2600 with 16GB of RAM paired with an RX 580 Armor. It had a 128GB SSD with a 500GB HDD all inside of a Thermaltake case. I added RGB fans and a hub, and in total I spent $212 for this PC. I sold it for $325 and profited $113. The second PC had an i5 6500 with 8GB of RAM paired with an RX 570. It had 256GB SSD and a 1TB HDD. In the beginning of this journey, I didn't really know how to price things, so I just took the price I paid and I divided it. Now I know how to price bundle deals, but I just wanted to let you know that I had no idea how to price things, and that's why the cost is kind of low. I'd also upgraded my case and storage, so I just used my old case and HDD in this build, hence the no cost for those things. So I spent $150 on the PC and I sold it for $300, profiting $150. I sold 2 PCs in September. I had listed these in the beginning of August, so I had them for a good month. I figure it was since school had started, so it was a slow time. The first PC I had an emotional attachment to. The CPU and motherboard used in it were gifted to me when I made my first custom PC. This PC had an i5 10400F with a B450 motherboard paired with 16GB of RAM and an RX 580. It had a 650W PSU, 256GB SSD with an 1TB HDD. This was all inside of a Skytech case I got in a bundle, so I spent $120 on it because of the CPU and motherboard they were gifted, and I sold it for $400 and made a profit of $280. The second PC was my first fish tank build. I got a GameMax case from Newegg for about $50 while it was on sale. This housed a Ryzen 5 2600, A320M board, which I low-key overpaid for because I got it for $50 and you should pay no more than like $40 for a used one. And I paired it with 16GB of RAM. I also put in another RX 580, which I had like 4 to 5 of these in the beginning, and I don't know why. The case didn't come with fans, so I got a pack of 3 and also bought an RGB controller. It had a 500W PSU, 256GB SSD, and a 1TB HDD. I spent $234 on it, which is more than I wanted to, but I sold it for $425, so the profit was $191, which is not bad. So in October, I also sold 2 PCs. Well, the first one I traded. The PC I traded had an i5 8400 with 16GB of RAM. It was paired with another RX 580, had 512GB of storage, and a 500W PSU. This was all housed in a nice Skytech case. In total, I spent $190.99. This guy offered me a PC with an i7 8700 for this PC, and don't worry, I did tell him that his processor was way better than the i5 8400, but he said he just wanted RGB, so I happily accepted the trade, so no profit. The second PC I sold in October rocked a Ryzen 5 3600. a 520M motherboard and 16GB of RAM. It was paired with a GTX 1660 and it had a 128GB NVMe and a 1TB HDD. It had a 500W PSU and it was housed in this really nice Gamdius case. The total for this build was $252 and I sold it for $450, making a profit of $198. Okay, so business was booming in November. I sold 3 PCs. I didn't make as much profit as I wanted to though, because these PCs had been listed for a while and I just wanted to get rid of them so I could have like a new inventory for Christmas. But this first build was another fish tank build. It had an i5-9400F H310M motherboard, 16GB of RAM, and it was paired with a GTX 1660 Super. It had a 256GB SSD and a 512GB SSD with a 500W PSU. It was all housed in this DIY PC case, and in total I spent $358 and I sold it for $400. So the profit was $42. Keep in mind for November, I am trying to get rid of these PCs so that I can have new inventory. Okay, so the second PC was made with parts from the traded PC. It had an i5-8500 with a Supermicro motherboard. I've never heard of that brand, but it had a Supermicro motherboard with 16GB of RAM and a GTX 1060, the 3GB version. But I ended up selling it without the GPU as the buyer had a better one. It had a 500W PSU housed in a Fantac case. In total, I spent $185 and I sold it for $200, so a measly $15 of profit. Again, do want to remind you, I'm trying to sell quick to stock up for Christmas. The third PC had an i5-6400, B360M motherboard, and 8GB of RAM. This was a bundle deal on eBay that was on auction, and I actually won it, which is why I didn't spend as much money on these items. I paired it with an RX 480 8GB. It had a 512GB SSD and a 500W PSU, all housed in this really sleek Montec case. In total, I spent $212.04 on it, and I sold it for $350, so a profit of $132.96. So hey, finally more than $100 of profit. So, Christmas season, December, I sold another 3 PCs. The first one was a budget build with an i5-3470, an old Gigabyte motherboard, and 16GB of RAM. It was paired with a 1050 Ti, and it had a 650W PSU. Which is overkill, I know, but the PSU was modular and it didn't come with a PCIe cable, so it just made sense to use the 1050 Ti. It had 512GB of storage and was housed in an old case that I had lying around. So in total I spent $110 on it and I sold it for $280 and made $170 profit. So the second PC was traded. It had an i7-8700K, a Z390 motherboard, and 16GB of RAM. It was paired with a GTX 1660 Super that I spray painted white. It had a 240GB SSD and a 1TB HDD. It had a 600W PSU and was housed in an NZXT H9 Flow that I got for $50. It was a crazy deal. In total, I spent $270.79 and I traded it for another PC with basically the same specs. It just had an i5-9600KF, so the buyer threw in $80, so the profit was $80. The next PC I actually sold while I was on vacation in Georgia. It had an AMD FX 8320 with an old AMD motherboard and 16GB of DDR3 RAM. It had a 500 watt PSU and was paired with a GTX 1660. The case was a Gamdius Aura, and it had a 512GB SSD. So in total, I spent $225 on it, and I sold it for $350, so I got $125 profit. So in January, I sold 2 PCs. Funny thing is, I sold both of them on the same day, back to back, and it was the day I got back from vacation. So the first build was a copy of the Gamdius one in December. It had an AMD FX 8320 with an old AMD motherboard and 16GB of DDR3 RAM. It also had a 500 watt PSU and a 512GB SSD. The only differences were I paired this one with the GTX 1060 that didn't sell in November, so the 1060 3GB version. I had gotten most of the parts from a PC that I got for $40, so the grand total was $60. I sold it for $300 and I got a profit of $240. So finally, profit that is over $200. So the second PC I sold had another eBay auction bundle. It had an i5 6400 MSI Z170A, 16GB of RAM, and was paired with a GTX 970 Turbo. It had a 500 watt PSU and 512GB of storage. It was housed in my brother's old iBuy power case, so in total I spent $153.73, and I sold it for $300 and profited $142.27. So let's take a look at each month. In August, I made $263 in profit. September, $471 in profit. October is $198. November, $194.96. December, $375. January, $382.27. So the grand total, the amount of profit I made within those 6 months, would be $1,884.23. Should you flip PCs is the big question, I guess. I would say yes, but it is a hard side hustle. It takes time, like, to test the parts and PCs and troubleshooting them if something goes wrong. If your heart is in it, it's really fun and honestly a learning experience. Like, I've learned to manage my expenses and time, which are really important for your everyday life. And in 6 months, I made almost $2,000. So yeah, it's a really fun side hustle. I will say it can be harder or easier depending on your area or where you're located. I'm near a big city, so it's a bit easier, but there are slow times. Like, when this gets released, it'll hopefully be middle of March. But yeah, so February, January, after I sold those 2 PCs, it's been really tough. I think I sold one online for the first time, and I sold a custom build, and I sold one last week. So 3 PCs, which is not bad, but it is a very slow time. I'm not getting as much messages as I would normally get, and I think it's because it's tax season. So hopefully in April business will pick up again, but like I said, it's hard. This side hustle is hard because of the waiting process. It's not a given that someone will buy it, but eventually someone will. You just have to be willing to wait that time. If you can, though, you should keep building instead of just sitting around and waiting for someone to buy it. Like, sooner or later someone will buy it, or you can swap out parts and stuff. Like, that's what I do. But sooner or later someone will buy it, so you shouldn't worry that much. Yeah, so my answer to should you flip PCs is yes, if your heart is in it. Yes, if you were willing to take the time to troubleshoot and to build these PCs and to list them and make them look nice. Yeah, go for it, because you have honestly nothing to lose. So yeah, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you're interested in flipping or building PCs, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.